All right, so let's read to see what the colonists did to rebel against all of the acts and all the taxes and how angry they were at the king. So we are in lesson 2, and it says the colonists rebel. You are there. It is the night of March 5th, 1770. The streets of Boston were covered with newly fallen snow. Despite all the cold weather, many people were out walking. Edward Garrick is among the Bostonians yelling insults at Hugh White. He was a British soldier on duty. So remember that the British soldiers had come over and they were still in the colony area and people didn't like them. They wanted them to go back to England. So White loses his temper and he hits Garrick in the head with the butt of his musket. Garrick's friends run over and begin shouting at White, calling him a bloody back and a lobster. Those insults were because they wore red uniforms. The British soldiers did. The crowd of colonists surrounding White grows quickly. White calls out for help. Help, help! And a group of soldiers, their muskets loaded, join White in the street. Colonists pelt the soldiers with snowballs and icicles and oyster shells. They did not want the British soldiers there. Tempers rise, and then the unexpected happens. The British fire their weapon into the angry crowd. Oh boy, that starts something right there. That is a huge sentence right there. Okay, the Boston Massacre. That's what I think we're getting ready to read about. Tensions had been rising in Boston since the British soldiers had first arrived in 1768. So now if you think about that, I just said over here that it started and we were in 1770. So the British soldiers have been there for a couple of years. Fist fights between soldiers and colonists were a common sight in the streets. So on the night of March 5th, 1770, which is where we started here, the city was ready to explode. When angry colonists surrounded Hugh White and his fellow soldiers, the soldiers panicked. They fired into the crowd, killing 5 people. Okay, so the British were in the crowd with the colonists. Okay, and so let's make sure that we understand. So we've got Edward Garrick, and he's from Boston. He's a colonist, and he's yelling insults at Hugh White, which is a British soldier. So Garrick is yelling, "You are a lobster back. Go home. We don't want you here." Okay, and it ends up in a fight, and then the colonists all come over, and then the British soldiers are all there together, and before you know it, the British soldiers fire their weapon into the angry crowd. So it says, when the angry colonists surrounded Hugh White and the other soldiers, the soldiers panicked. They fired into the crowd and it killed 5 people. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. A massacre is a killing of many people who cannot defend themselves. And I think that people just started firing their guns and hitting each other, and it just became total chaos. Looks like a picture of it right down here. Let's finish reading it. It says one of the victims was Crispus Attucks. He was born into slavery. Attucks escaped slavery at age 27 and began working as a sailor. On the night of that shooting, he had led a group of sailors to the scene of the protest. The British soldiers were put on trial for murder in Boston. They were defended in court by John Adams, a cousin of Samuel Adams that we had read about. Like Samuel, John Adams opposed the British taxes and did not like having British soldiers in Boston. Still, he felt the soldiers deserved a fair trial, and the court ruled that the soldiers were not guilty of murder the night that they fired and killed the 5 people. Okay, so here's a picture of Crispus Attucks, and he was one of the victims of the Boston Massacre. Victims mean he was one of on our side. Okay, down here in the center of Boston, you can find a patch of cobblestone near the old State House. They have been preserved in memory of Crispus Attucks and the other protesters who were killed at this spot, the site of the Boston Massacre. So it's still there today, and this happened in 1770, a long time ago. This is the church or the state building, and this is the stones that have been preserved. Okay, so we've got the committees of correspondence. That sounds kind of boring. Let's see. On the same day as the Boston Massacre, Parliament, that would be back in England, voted to repeal, to take away the Townshend Acts. The colonial boycott was hurting British businesses, so Parliament canceled all the taxes but one. They decided they were going to keep the tax on tea. Remember I told you, England really likes their tea. Okay, British leaders knew they would not collect much money from the tea tax. Their goal was to show the colonists that they still had the right to tax the colonists. So even though they knew they weren't going to make much money, they did it anyway because they wanted to show who was the boss. It's not going to work. We already know that. Samuel Adams, he kept busy working on this new problem. He felt it took too long for the news to come from England, or from one of the colonies, from one of the colonies to another colony. They didn't have telephones. If the colonists were going to work together in the future, they would need a faster way to share their news. So Adams, smart guy, formed a committee of correspondence in Boston in 1772, 2 years later. So he says, something's got to happen. Something's got to change. When I want a message to get from Virginia to Rhode Island, it takes too long. They had to pass it through mouth or ride a horse. So let's see what his idea is. So he makes a committee called the Committee of Correspondence. And they were formed in towns all over the colonies. Members of these committees corresponded or wrote to each other about local events. The letters were delivered by express riders on fast horses. One rider was a silversmith named Paul Revere. He could make the trip from Boston to New York and back in about a week. Look at the map below to see the time it took for the express riders to deliver messages. So if we look up here, this is where Boston is. So if Boston wanted to get a message down here, it took a long time. So that's why they created, somebody could write a letter up here and they would deliver it to here, and maybe they would deliver it to here, or maybe somebody on a horse would deliver it all the way from here down to here. So if we read this, it's called the Express Riders in the 1770s. It says, you are an express rider. You're going to deliver messages from Sam Adams in Boston. Adams asks you to leave today to get a message to Charleston. That's way down here. He wants to know by what date you can get it there. It's now May 2nd. Wonder, what do you tell him? How long would it take you to get there? Number 2, when you reach Baltimore, that's right here in the middle, the local Committee of Correspondence gives you a message for the committee in Williamsburg, which is right down here. By what date do you deliver that message? And after you finally reach Charleston down here, you rest for 2 days before beginning the return trip all the way back up to Boston. And by what date do you return home? The express rider says the numbers show average number of days. So to go from Boston down to this area was 4 days, and then 2 days from New York to Philadelphia, and 10 days from Williamsburg to Charleston. That's a long time to be gone and doing that. Okay, let's look at the Boston Tea Party. In 1773, committees of correspondence began writing about the tea tax, a new law that was passed by Parliament. The tea tax said that one British company, the East India Company, would be the only company allowed to sell tea to the colonists. If you owned a store in the colonies, you had to buy your tea from the East India Company, and you would still have to pay the tax. The tea tax had 2 goals. The first goal was to help the struggling East India Company. Well, yeah, if they're the only ones that can sell, then they're the ones that are going to make the money. But the second goal was to get the colonists to pay taxes to Britain. So the colonists had refused to pay British taxes. They were not about to start right now. They also did not like the idea of being forced to buy tea from one company and one company only. So colonists declared that ships bringing British tea to the colonies were not allowed to unload at the colonies. In late 1773, 3 ships carrying British tea sailed into Boston Harbor. On the night of December 16th, members of the Sons of Liberty, they disguised themselves as Mohawks. They wanted to look like the Indians. They rowed out to the British ships because those great big ships can't come all the way up to shore. So they dock out in the water a little bit. So they rowed out to the British ships shouting, "Boston Harbor, a teapot tonight." They boarded the ships. They chopped open the wooden chest of teas with axes, and they dumped the tea into the harbor. This became known as the Boston Tea Party. Soon the colonists were singing a new song. "Rally, Mohawks, bring out your axes and tell King George we'll pay no more taxes." What news of the Boston Tea Party? When news of that reached back to London, British leaders were furious. Parliament and King George, woo! They thought that the colonists needed to be punished. So, guess what? Britain punishes Boston. Britain punishes the people of Boston severely for the Boston Tea Party. The punishment included these actions. The British soldiers who had been removed from Boston after the Boston Massacre were now sent back. Colonists were ordered to feed and house the soldiers. Nobody wanted those soldiers in their colony, and they certainly didn't want them in their houses. But that's what the king ordered. The soldiers are going to live in your houses. Then the colony of Massachusetts was put under control of a British general named Thomas Gage. So there was a pretty important guy came over from London named Thomas Gage. And then the third one, the port of Boston, where all the ships came, they closed it. So no ships would be allowed to come or go until the people of Boston paid for the tea that they had destroyed. The colonists began calling all of these laws intolerable. Intolerable means we can't stand it. We can't live like this. We can't stand it, and we're not going to do it. So they started getting really angry. So these are called the Intolerable Acts. The closing of Boston's port hurt the city badly, and Boston's economy depended on trade, and soon many people were out of work. Other colonies began helping Boston by sending them food and supply and monies. I'm going to go back up here, and I'm going to remember Boston is up in this area. So all these other colonists that were down in these areas, they began to help Boston. Boston survived by having boats come in, and they brought all the goods that they needed. So I see how that's hurting their businesses. So the Intolerable Acts had many effects. Okay, we've talked a lot about cause and effect. They forced the colonists to take sides between Boston or Britain. Are you going to be on the Boston side, or are you going to be on Britain, England side? Colonists opposed the British rule. That means they did not like the king. Oppose means against. So all the colonists who were against, they were called patriots. And the colonists who still said, we need to be nice to King George. We need to obey him. He helped us get over here. Well, they become known as loyalists because they were loyal to the king. So we want to know patriots versus loyalists. At the same time, the committees of correspondence that they had set up, they began spreading the idea of a meeting. Leaders from 12 colonies agreed to meet in Philadelphia, the largest city of the colonies. And they would discuss how they were going to treat this, how they were going to say, these are intolerable acts. So in September of 1774, representatives from every colony except for Georgia met at what they called the First Continental Congress meeting. And it was in Philadelphia, the biggest city. One man who represented Virginia at the meeting, his name was George Washington. Have you ever heard of him? Bet you have. Washington was a wealthy farmer and a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. As you read in Chapter 7, he had fought with the British during the French and Indian War. Now he was ready to fight against the British, if necessary. He made this promise right here. I will raise 1,000 men and march myself at the head for the relief of Boston. So he's kind of changed his sides. So at the First Continental Congress, Washington and his fellow patriots voted to stop all trade with Britain until the Intolerable Acts were repealed. They also agreed that each colony should begin training militias or volunteer armies. So a militia is a volunteer army. The colonial leaders agreed to meet again in 1 year. If the situation had not improved, so they said, we're going to meet back here in 1 year. So these things don't happen really very fast. So at this point, however, most of the colonists hoped that their dispute with Britain would be settled peacefully. The Patriots, which is the people against British, the Patriot leaders went home and they began organizing the militias, which is the volunteer armies. Some militia groups called themselves Minutemen because they could be ready at a minute's notice to fight for their country. And the last thing, we're not going to read this page on George Washington, just this page right over here. Liberty or death. In March 1775, Patrick Henry made the most famous speech of his career, speaking in a church in Richmond, Virginia. Henry warned Virginia's militias are volunteer armies, to prepare for battle because war with Britain was coming, he said, and he was ready for it. He ended with these bold words right here. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty. That means give me freedom. Or just give me death. So that's where that saying, give me liberty or give me death, comes from. British leaders were not about to back down. Like Patrick Henry, King George was ready to fight. King George wasn't backing down. He said, okay, you guys want to fight? We'll fight. He told Parliament that blows must decide how the conflict between Britain and the colonies would be settled. Patrick Henry and the King George would agree on one thing. A war was about to begin. Okay, your assignment for today. You do not have to answer those questions, but make sure, you might want to read through them and make sure that you understand the causes and what the effects was. So, I'm just going to say, make sure that you understand that. So if you notice, there's lots of yellow highlighted words. There are approximately 20 words. Some of them are people. Some of them are like the Boston Tea Party or the Boston Massacre. I want you to pick, let's say 8 of them. 8 of them, write them on a piece of paper and tell me what they are. Okay? Any 8 of them that you want, you pick and put on a piece of paper and tell me what they mean.